The injustice that has been done to Africa cannot be accepted. We are going to celebrate 80 years of the United Nations. We cannot do that with the configuration of the Security Council as we have, which is totally unfair to us as a continent.
For years, countries have been calling for a more inclusive and a more representative council.
Africa represents 54 of the 193 states that make up the United Nations. We are 1.3 billion people. We cannot just be a territory for proxy wars and be used by others. We have a voice.
So we've been very, very clear that we do not support expansion of the veto. And we have veto power as well, and none of the permanent members want to give up their veto power, including us. I'm being honest about that. We don't want to give up our veto power, and we do think if we expand that veto power across the board, it will make the council more dysfunctional.
What an insult. If we're talking any of the other European countries joining as members of the UN Security Council with veto power, would she still find it as a move that will introduce dysfunction? Or is it the introduction of two Black African countries that is problematic? What really makes it very sad is that the voices are coming out of the mouth of a Black woman.
There's a story happening in the United Nations right now that I think is linked to the images you see right now on your screen. Now, it's my belief that there is going to be consequences for the West if they don't start to change their ways. So if you're curious to find out what I think could be the downfall of the Western global superpower running the world, stay tuned. For those of you that don't know me, my name is TJ. I am Nigerian and British mixed. Currently, I live in Uganda with my partner Medina, which is a big change for me because I grew up mostly in the United Kingdom. Since I've been on the continent of Africa, I've realized that Africa is not living up to its full potential. So this channel is all about figuring out ways, opening up discussions about how Africa can achieve that full potential. And it seems like lately, every day I hear something new about how the West actually manipulates Africa, and it's not even hidden, it's in plain sight. However, lately, slowly but surely, African nations have started moving away from Western control through various methods. The Sahel region is decoupling themselves from French colonial power. The newly elected president of Namibia has just changed all visa requirements for people from Western countries that don't practice reciprocal visa status for Namibians. And right now, there is a cry for Africa to have permanent representation on the Security Council in the United Nations. Now, this is something that I've only just started understanding. So just in case there's anyone else like me that doesn't understand the full implications of the control that the UN has, let's set the stage and get some information right now.
But there are certain countries in the UN that get to exercise real power. We're talking about the UN Security Council's permanent 5 members, or P5. They all have what's known as the right to veto. The Council is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations, which was founded in October 1945. Created in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the UN's goal was to, as their charter puts it, quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The permanent 5 members of the Security Council were established and granted veto power, meaning their single negative vote carries the power to reject a resolution. Some of the body's powers and responsibilities include to investigate threats to international peace, to recommend a resolution process, to impose and lift sanctions, and to even enforce military intervention. It's done all of those at various times, including military action against Gaddafi in Libya in 2011 and sanctions against Iran in response to their nuclear program in 2006. The P5 also set aside another 6, eventually becoming 10, non-permanent membership spots. Non-permanent members rotate every 2 years. For resolutions to pass, 9 out of the 15 total members on the Council have to vote in favor. So even though they don't have veto power, temporary members still have a really important job. But if even one of the P5 states vetoes a resolution, that's it. And that's happened hundreds of times since the Council was founded, often in cases where that state has been accused of advancing its own political interests in the face of global crises.
So the United Nations represent just under 200 countries in the world. Of those nearly 200 countries, 54 of them are African nations. Yet Africa does not have a seat at the Security Council of the UN, meaning when they do their resolutions, which is what they call the actions that they take, Africa does not have a say. Now, they have something called non-permanent seats. These are a few extra seats aside from the 5 flags that you see here in the image. Sometimes those are African nations, but those seats rotate. And apart from these 5 countries, none of the countries represented by the UN have veto power, meaning if the whole of the UN vote to take action on something, but one of these 5 countries don't like it, they have the power to end that action. This means that the world's security decisions in the UN are controlled by 5 countries. And I repeat, none of them represent a single country in Africa, which makes up 1/4 of the countries that the UN have jurisdiction over. You heard just now in the video how they all agreed to go after Gaddafi. Now, whose interest was that in favor of? If you ask the average African, they'll say that was not in the favor of Africans. And this sentiment of decisions that are made about Africa that happen on the continent of Africa, not having the best interests of Africa at heart, are at the core of the frustration that African leaders talk about.
The United Nation is the United Nation. I don't know how united it is.
But Lady Speaking is the First Lady of Sierra Leone.
One of the most serious issues I have with the United Nations is the fact that Africa is not part of the Security Council. We're talking about 54 countries, a whole continent does not have one person representing Africa when it comes to decision making at the Security Council. I believe that also that Africans' issue can only be enhanced when Africans decide to do that. They should not allow another person to give them a prescription of how Africa should look like or what we need in our Africa, because we know what we need in our Africa. No one will know that better than us. And I think the UN should see Africa as partners. And the United Nations, definitely, you cannot have 7 countries vetoing everything. When it comes to Africa issue, it is those 7 countries. Who are the countries that are actually exploiting Africa? They're the ones who have the veto power to make decision on anything that has to do with Africa. So for me, I think that is wrong. And that is one thing the president of Sierra Leone has campaigned for. And this year, Sierra Leone is now a non-permanent member at the United Nations. But yet still, we don't have a veto power.
Notice how those that have the veto power are also the countries that are able to take the most resources out of the continent of Africa. This is not a coincidence. They get to decide the policies on how the rest of the world acts within Africa. If they want to send troops or armies into this situation or that, they get to make that decision without Africans actually having a say. And yes, you can say that in the non-permanent seats, Africa has a say. But the bottom line is the final decision rests with those 5 countries, all of whom have massive interest in extracting the resources of Africa and do not necessarily have the people of Africa at heart. She also mentioned that the UN should see Africa as partners. And here is where my mind started to work, because it's been hundreds of years that the West has failed to make partnership with Africa. What they do is create lopsided deals, whether it be the CFA franc, which I've spoken a lot about in this channel, which is a totally predatory financial system. You're seeing it here in the UN. You know, when I was in the UK and I heard anything about the UN on the news, it was all about how the UN are this righteous group. I didn't even understand that Africa was not part of the final decision-making process. So imagine, after hundreds of years of not being treated as equals, going through colonialism, going through slavery, going through neo-colonialism, where they're given token power like that of the UN, what do you think the attitude towards the West, who refuse to actually partner with Africa, will be? How long before people on the continent become so soured towards the West that there is no option for friendly, reciprocal cooperation? Slowly but surely, Africa is crawling back its power. You see, when it comes to the growing demographics and economic growth of Africa, The strength is building within the continent, not to mention the technologies that are leveling the playing field. I've mentioned many times, cheap satellite internet is coming to Africa. Whether you're on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro or you're on the top of a pyramid in Egypt, you'll be able to get fast, cheap internet direct to your phone. Then we have AI, where we'll get healthcare and schooling. And then all of these Western populations are shrinking in size, while the African population is exploding in size. The West have to start making concessions, and here's what the beginning of that looks like.
For years, countries have been calling for a more inclusive and a more representative council, one that reflects the demographics of today's world and better responds to the challenges that we face today. It's why 2 years ago, President Biden announced that the United States supports expanding the Security Council to provide permanent representation for countries from Africa, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean, that in addition to the countries we long supported for permanent seats, India, Japan, and Germany, we would support Africa and the Latin America and the Caribbean. So in addition to reform commitments we've already made, today I'm announcing the United States supports 3 additional changes to the Security Council. First, I want to start with Africa. This is in many ways personal to me. As you know, I have lived and worked across the continent. I have traveled extensively across Africa, and so I know firsthand the diversity and the talent, the depth and breadth of expertise and experiences on the African continent. As it stands, there are currently 3 non-permanent seats on the Security Council allocated to African countries on a rotating basis for 2 years. The problem is these elected seats don't enable African countries to deliver the full benefit of their knowledge and voices to the work of the Council, to consistently lead on the challenges that affect all of us and disproportionately affect Africa. That is why, in addition to non-permanent memberships for African countries, the United States supports creating 2 permanent seats for Africa on the Council. It's what our African partners seek, and we believe this is what is just.
So this sounds good at first hearing, but there's some things that I find really irritating about what she said. She paints the picture that for years America has, been really rooting to have Africa have this say. And, for years we've wanted equity. I think this is what is just. Actions speak louder than words. If you thought it was just, if you were rooting for Africa to have its say, if you really had the fairness of Africa at heart, this would have been done long time ago. This is why Biden pushed for it. Well, why didn't Obama do it? Half Kenyan. Why didn't Bill Clinton do it? George Bush do it? George Bush Sr. do it? All of these years since the Second World War, it's now 2025 when you suddenly recognize this plight. This is disingenuous, and it's disingenuous for a further reason.
Okay, so permanent membership comes with a lot of perks, just like council membership comes with a lot of perks, and that's the veto. So these new members, are they going to have veto power?
So we've been very, very clear that we do not support expansion of the veto. And, I've had a number of discussions with my African colleagues who put this kind of take it or leave it position on the table. We get 2 seats and we get the veto. And the reason we want the veto is because you have it. But the reason we hate the veto is because it makes the council dysfunctional.
She's playing fast and loose with words here. America, who she represents, do not support expansion of veto, which means that same 5 countries will still have the power over the nearly 200 countries represented, regardless of who has a permanent or a non-permanent seat. Very key. The second thing is, she says that Africa claims the veto power is dysfunctional. Yes, it's dysfunctional, but not for the reason she says it's dysfunctional. It's dysfunctional because only 5 countries get to have it. If every region had the opportunity to have veto power, it would be fair. It would not be dysfunctional. But she's making it seem like if we add you guys, it will mean more dysfunction.
And so if veto makes the veto power makes the council dysfunctional in their view, why would you expand it? And that's what I have said to them. Why would you want to expand the veto power? What you should be working to do is what your actual goal is to limit the veto power.
So we should be working to limit the veto power, not actually have the veto power. A child can understand that if a group is not represented to have final say, then that group cannot ultimately act in the interests of itself, as long as every group that has final say, the veto power, can stop whatever they want to do.
Well, and I think we all know that the veto is so destructive, especially when it comes to Russia and China using their veto power.
Yes, any country that uses the veto power against the interests of another country, why wouldn't the Americans say that it's so destructive? Don't you think that the Chinese and the Russians feel the same way when the Americans, the French, and the British use their veto power against the interests of those two nations? And is it not even more destructive for the countries that have no veto power at all? If Africa was to take 2 permanent seats and have 2 lots of veto power, the dynamics of the UN would shift entirely. Think about the BRICS nations. Africa is siding with Russia and China over the West. That's what's happening in Sahel. And me, myself, I observe this when I'm on the continent. There's Chinese hotels and Chinese factories and Chinese building the airports, Chinese building infrastructure and bridges and roads. I don't see America doing any of that. If the veto power is so dysfunctional, then wouldn't it make sense for you not to want it for yourself? Then why would you want to hold on to it so vehemently? And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to hers.
So why retain it? Why don't we just have permanent members and nobody has a veto?
Yeah, and we have veto power as well, and none of the permanent members want to give up their veto power, including us. I'm being honest about that. We don't want to give up our veto power, and we do think if we expand that veto power across the board, it will make the council more dysfunctional.
If we expand that veto power, it will make the council more dysfunctional. If you listen to them long enough, they will show you who they are. They only have their interests at heart. It's clear. Why don't you just say, look, we're here to protect our interests. That's it. I would respect that more. So let's listen to what our very own Dr. Arikana has to say about that.
What an insult. If this particular situation, we're talking a country like Germany, if we're talking any of the other European countries joining as members of the UN Security Council with veto power, would she still find it as a move that will introduce dysfunction? Or is it the introduction of 2 Black African countries that is problematic? What really makes it very sad is that the voices are coming out of the mouth of a Black woman. Those words are coming out of the mouth of an African American who must understand certain language cannot be used, particularly when we're talking about the international platform. To suggest that introducing 2 African countries will introduce dysfunction, it is sad, it is disrespectful, and it will not be tolerated. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield really needs to retract those words, and she needs to explain herself to say, what do you mean dysfunction? Exactly how are the 2 African countries going to introduce dysfunction, unless, of course, the entity has already been dysfunctional, which in my opinion is the case, and that is what really is the problem with the United Nations. It's a dysfunctional entity. It is a toothless bulldog, and they need to do what they are mandated to do by the world. So yes, no, Africa is not going to introduce any dysfunction at the United Nations. The entity itself has been dysfunctional. Maybe an addition of 2 African countries might straighten it up and create some normalcy, and for a change have an entity that's going to truly represent people of the world.
As usual, she said it all there. And this is the growing sentiment. You heard the passion, you heard the frustration, and guess what? The everyday youth in Africa is starting to understand these things. People are starting to be frustrated, and there is a growing sentiment of true hatred brewing in the underbelly of Africa. I am here on ground, and I hear the way people talk about the West, about white people, about what they've done for colonialism, about the way they divided up Africa, about what Leopold did in Belgium, about what the Germans did in Namibia, and to pour salt on all of those historical wounds. You've got these kinds of games happening at the current time while people are dying in Congo for the interests of these countries that have veto power. And this takes us back to the original video I played.
Alliance shoot to kill Gaza, kill the poor, the farmer, kill the poor, the farmer. Brr, pa, pa, brr, pa, pa. Attention.
I want to start off by saying it is not me that holds the sentiment of this group you hear chanting kill the Boer right now. And I do not personally condone any violence. I would not suggest anybody else engages in any violence whatsoever. I am for peaceful, democratic, and diplomatic resolution to any problem. So that is my position. But the position of the everyday African may not be so peaceful. And what you have here is South Africans in a stadium, and it's happened on more than one occasion, where they are essentially singing a song that advocates for anything other than a peaceful resolution when it comes to dealing with white people, the West, and those that choose to try and control the interest of African people. So right now, the power is with the West. You have the US, you have Europe, they have the money, they have the power, they have the might. But what happens when the world's population becomes 1/4 or 1/2 African? You see, that is what is going to happen over the next 50 years. What happens when technology allows Africa to rise to a level playing field? That pendulum is very likely to start swinging back towards the Africans. And if Africa ever did manage to climb its way back to a supreme global power in the world, the West is going to be begging for fairness. But what has happened for hundreds of years is that the West has created a scenario to brew up hatred in the hearts of the average African. And when it's Africa's turn to shine, if that power change ever happens, those that were oppressed will rise up and remember what was done to them, and they very well may pay back double, triple, quadruple the pain and suffering that was paid to them. I believe in the principle that you reap what you sow. So the West better start waking up now before the attitudes of negativity become so overwhelming that there will be no way to avoid the consequences of the crimes and sins that have been committed on the African continent. Now, I'm sure many of you out there have something to say about all of this. And I underline once again that hatred is not the answer. But if you don't have anything to say, would it be too much for me to ask you to write the word veto power in the comment section? It lets me know that you're supporting the channel, you like the content, and you want me to continue. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.